Thank you. It seems that we keep the time because the break had started late, but let's start the show. Okay. So I'll tell you indeed on bumps and traffic lights, and this is a highlight talk, and it's a highlight talk, and it was published in PLOS Computational Biology on speed control and translation. And as you can see, it was led by Shelly Machleb, a really talented PhD student that is in the audience. And I encourage you to go through the bumps and go to poster L74 to get more information if you are interested in. So we'll talk a little bit about what it is all about when we talk about translational proteome. And then I'll share with you a few hints on evolution, how evolution shape a proteome, and I'll share some concept around it. And then we'll go to some hypotheses and tests on the secretary proteome. And I hope we'll get to the conclusion. So let's start from the very basic on translation. So translation, as we are all aware, is one of the fundamental processes and the most expensive process in terms of resources, in terms of investment of the cell, for energy, so there is a little bit of an underestimate level of control that we tend to put on translation, and this is basically one of the messages that I would like to share with you. So translation is, from the textbook, is really divided to three parts. We discuss elongation, and elongation is the step in which the ribosome is moving on the messenger RNA or vice versa, but in any case, form this peptide bond in which the bond is formed. Of course, it's an energy-dependent process, and then all the coding and all the specificity is based on the anticodon-codon interaction. So another part from this Bio 101, the molecules that was a little bit underestimated in this process or talked less about is the tRNA. It's a very complex molecules, but from our perspective, the only things that matter for this talk is the fact that you can have the same tRNA that will decode two different codons. And the decoding is done by some rules, we call the Wobble rules, because as you can see, the third letter of the codon can be different, and this means that the first position in the Wobble position can be different, but still it will decode the same amino acid. In this case, it's alanine. So just remember this, that it's not a one-to-one, but it has some hidden rules here. So let me just illustrate it in a more specific way. So let's say that we have, I say that it's a little bit disturbed, but let's say we have an alanine, and it has 4 codons. Do I have this magic something? Never mind. Okay, so you have this codon, sorry. You have 4 codons, and only 3 in orange isoacceptor groups in which they can decode all those 4 codons. And more importantly is the number of tRNA that decodes each and every type of those codons is different very much. So let me just generalize it instead of just talking on alanine. So we have 20 amino acids. We have in human 50 tRNA isoacceptors groups. We have 61 or 64 codons, depending if you count the stop codons. And for our discussion, for alanine, we have 43 tRNA genes. Moreover, in the entire genome of the human genome, we have 512 genes for tRNA. But as you can see from this diagram, they are not distributed randomly, but they have a very different copy number. So indeed, if we talk about the copy number, I want to show you that if you take the vertebrate, this is just a list of vertebrate randomly selected, you can see that the number, the copy number of many vertebrates differ dramatically. Some of them, such as the chicken and the turkey, have only, let's say, something around 150, but we have organisms like the cow and the zebrafish and so on that have thousands and thousands of genes, of tRNA genes. This is something I just put in orange, the human, just to show that it's not an extreme case. So the point that I want to mention, and I won't convince you, but take it as a statement, is that the copy number itself strongly correlates with the actual quantities of tRNA within the cell. Okay, so it's not just the number of genes, but actually how much tRNA we have at any certain point. So once we have this, we can show that indeed the copy number, the genomic copy number, which is the x-axis, and the amino acid usage very nicely correlated. Just look at the alanine that I mentioned before with the 43 tRNA. You can see that it's a fairly strong correlation throughout. And this is, by the way, true for many organisms. So this is just an illustration that we care about those numbers, okay? So everything that I told you can be cooked into a one index that we called it tRNA adaptation index, or in short, TAI, which is an indirect measure for the effectiveness of translation. And it's only capture two features. One is the Wobble thermodynamics interaction that I mentioned before, and the second is the copy number. So once you take both elements, you can have a value or some index for each codon, but also because of this for each proteins, or you can extend it to each proteome. Okay, so now we can use this as a measure. So this is the background that I need in order to go further, and let's mention the evolution part. So as I showed you, the codon, in this case of the alanine, you can see that the alanine, the first line, it has 4 codons, as I showed you, but some TAI of some codons are very low. The value, it doesn't matter, but 0.24, and the other is very high, 0.83, and you see a huge range. On the other hand, if you go to arginine, despite the fact that it has 6 codon, the TAI is very low, and it's not diverse at all. So having arginine doesn't matter. You just it doesn't matter which codon to use, basically. Okay, so I hope I can share with you the intuition, and then let's go. So once we have a value for each codon, and you can see that some of them are really ranged dramatically, you can have the same calculation for each protein. And you can push it also for the proteome. So to get the distribution of any proteome, you can think of what's the usage of TAI in this matter. Okay. Another point that is not trivial, not intuitive, I would say, is the fact that if you go to different organisms, you see that the correlation between the codon, the value that I just explained, how you calculate, for example, in the C. elegans and the human, doesn't seem so tight. It means that each organism finds its own solution in terms of TAI. So in a more general statement, I can show you all those correlations between human and Drosophila, human and plant, and cow, and so on. You see that the correlation is poor. Namely, each organism has its own kind of refinement in terms of TAI. Once we have this, let's look if we have indeed, we can use large-scale proteomics data in order to understand something. Is there any connection between the TAI that I just explained of this proteome and the properties of the proteins? Because maybe it's just a nice game. So we took 3 different experimental large-scale experiments on proteomics, from mass spectrometry, from GFP expression. All of them aims to tell us how much protein we have. And what we have in these 3 different data sets is we have between 2,000 and 4,000 proteins that are observed. Namely, they can be captured by those methods, and the same number that were not captured. By the way, the overlap between the methods is pretty high. So most of the protein that I've seen by one method will be seen by the others. But if we just take this very naive and a little bit too naive separation between seen and non-seen, we can see that in each and every method, never mind what the method is, there is a huge difference in the TAI between those that have seen, observed in blue, and those that were missing. Just to put it in some kind of a take-home message, the global TAI that I just explained is a proxy for protein quantity, abundance, which is kind of nice because it's a very naive measure and tells us something about abundancy, quantity. Okay, so that's nice, but what can we learn about unique set of proteins? And I want to focus on the secretory proteome. So for that, I need to explain what I'm talking about. Okay, so what's the secretory proteomes? We know that proteins in any eukaryotic cells can be translated by two types of either free or bound ribosome. And the free ribosomes are production of the cytosolic protein. All the ER-bound ribosome are responsible for the secretory proteome. So our question is, are those free and bound under the same constraint, evolutionary constraint? Or in other ways, we hypothesize that the secretory proteome is under unique regulation and tight control for translation success. So we ask ourselves, is this the case? In order to do this, we have to explain just one thing. What are those secretory? What's the zip code for being a secretory protein? So one of the major zip code is this signal sequence that indeed is telling us that this protein will go and translocate to the ER. And as you can see in the bottom, the sequence itself, it's not very well conserved, but it has a patch of hydrophobicity and some specific amino acids, small amino acids, A or G in the end, and it's about 20 to 24 in length. But still, no matter what, and no matter in what organism, this is the code to translocate it to the ER. So in human, it's account for 37% of the proteome of human. And in most organisms, it's about a third of the protein will be a part of the secretory system. So in going a little bit deeper, we can see that the secretory protein defined by three different groups, big groups. See on the top, the green one, which is transmembrane domain. So they don't have signal peptide, still they are attached and hooked to any membrane. So those are the biggest part, by the way. The other two parts have a signal peptides, as you can see in red, and the signal peptides can be with a transmembrane domain or without. So those that are without are mainly the secretory protein, the protein that are secreted from the cell, such as hormones and so on, and growth factors and so on and so forth. So now I defined for you what is indeed the secretory proteome. Are those three groups excluding the cytosol, okay? So now we know what we are talking about. Okay, when we look back to the global TAI, what are the proteome TAI? We can see something very striking, that the secreted proteins, which are those that are outside of the cells and they have signal peptides, have a very high TAI, much higher than the other groups of the secretory system. So it's separated between the secreted and the membranous proteins. Is it true for all organisms? Now, I want to remind you that each organism has its own tricks. Remember the graph that I showed you, that there is very poor correlation. Still, all organisms have the same property. Namely, if you go to Drosophila, to C. elegans, to bovine, they are all having a very high TAI for their specific secreted protein, the subset of the secreted protein. So the conclusion is that despite these differences, each and every proteins in different organisms really tuned evolutionary the sequence so that the secreted protein will have a high TAI. And now I want to say, so we talked about quantity. So TAI is important in quantity. I want to say something about TAI relation to speed. What I mean by speed, if you go to, let's say, ribosome profiling, you can measure where the ribosomes are situated along the mRNA. And just to show you one scheme, you can see that in this scheme, they are packed in the beginning, and then they start spreading, which means the interpretation is that the density is inversely correlated with speed. So when you have high speed, they are spread. When they are compiled together, it means they are going very slow. Okay, once you have this intuition, we know that the composition of the coding, of the codons along the transcript really control and management of ribosome flow, which I called speed. So just let's say you have a peptide, T, R, A, N, S, and so on, and you want to translate it. And let's say, just for simplicity, that each codon has only 2 versions, not 4, not 6, just 2. So you can either do it by this, and you'll get this peptide. You can do it by this, and you get the same peptide. But let's say number 1 is a low TAI, as I mentioned. Number 2 is a high TAI. And as I say, it's related to speed. But you can do something else. You can take the same one and do this, right? You'll get the same result. But now, the speed control is different. You can do this, or you can do this, or you can do this. So there are endless combinations that you can use, and our question is, what was indeed used, okay? So when you do this, there was an interesting paper that present a ramp model, which say you just want to avoid jam, traffic jam, and the only way to do it is to put a very low TAI value in the beginning and then speed up. So the ramp was presented in 2010-11, and we asked ourselves, should it be generalized to the secretory system? And so let me show you what we did. We designed a measure, which is a window goes all the way and ask what is the TAI of the window along the length of the mRNA. And this is just an example for this windows going from the N terminal and for the C terminal. Avoid everything in between. So when we do this, we saw that every protein that has, or all the proteome that have a signal peptide, the same signal peptide that I mentioned, have a very low TAI in the beginning. So it means that this rule of the ramp apply very nicely. Does it apply to all the others? The answer is not. I'm about to finish. The answer is not. Actually, the difference between this secretory system and the cytosol is extremely high. And just to say, this is true for all the organism. This is just to show you, this is the cytosol. You see that the N terminal and the C terminal are kind of high TAI. If you go to the other groups that I discussed, you see that only protein with the signal peptide has this ramp. So, and why do we need it? Just to show you why do we need it, I want to just show, if I have just 1 minute, I'll show it. And okay, I want to show something that is conceptually important. To do a signal peptide, you have to do it, but there are many steps that comes immediately after. So you need to build a delayer, something that will stop you. And the way you do it is because once the signal peptide is out, it still has to bound to this signal peptide particle, and then to the receptor. And then, once the receptor is bound, you have to do the translocation. And only then you have to translocate it to the ER, and only end to cut it. So there are multi-steps events that occurs, so you must have a delayer. And we believe that this is the delayer system that is responsible for this signal peptide. Just to finish up, because my time is gone, is to say that the same principle is true not only for signal peptide, but to other signals that have to be multi-step delayers, such as GPI proteins. So just to conclude, the last slide, I want to mention the translation and control of speed is important for folding, for accuracy, for the cost, for quantity, but I only discuss speed and quantity. And basically, I want to say, I want to go over the conclusion, but the majority of the proteins in the cells do not have a ramp. It's only the secretory systems that needs of the signal peptides that needs this. And this is just a graph that summarizes everything that I said. that docking of the ribosome, cleavage of the signal peptide, folding, anchoring of GPI, and recyclings are all dependent on inherently delayed signal within the proteome. So thank you so much.
We have time for really only for one question at most. And if you don't, I'll ask it. Okay. He got it first. So.
Which kind of rules do you use to assign the reading of DNA? But this is not settled issue. In particular, I would like to know if you allow a codon be decoded by different anti-codons.
No, so I'm using the textbook rules. I'm not making any rules. The only thing that I added here is the thermodynamics, how much to pay for if the same isoacceptor group is doing more than one. So it's by the book. We can talk about it, but it's very trivial. I'm not making any new rules, if that's the questions. Of course.
Okay. Thank you very much.